Book Nibbles. Big Ideas, Small Bites. Paul Kalanithi's When Breath Becomes Air is not only a memoir but also a meditation on what it means to live with meaning, to face mortality with clarity, and to reconcile the aspirations of the mind with the finitude of the body. To retell the story in depth is to follow Paul's journey from curious boy to brilliant neurosurgeon, then from doctor to patient, and finally from seeker of knowledge to philosopher of life in the truest sense. The book opens with an awareness that this is not just a story of dying, but of living in the full light of death. Paul was 36 years old, on the cusp of becoming a world-class neurosurgeon, when he was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. Everything he had worked toward, all the grueling years of study, sacrifice, and promise of future achievements, was suddenly reframed. The life he expected to stretch decades ahead now condensed into months or perhaps a year or two. Yet his instinct was not to despair, but to write, to examine, to ask the ultimate questions about how to live when time is short. Paul grew up in Kingman, Arizona, in a desert town where the landscape itself shaped his early imagination. His parents, both highly educated, instilled in him a love of books and learning. His father was a physician, whose long hours in a struggling rural practice exposed Paul to the world of medicine, though not initially in an appealing way. His mother, determined that her children would have access to the best education possible, stocked the house with classic literature and ensured that Paul read widely and deeply. He devoured works of philosophy, novels, and poetry, and from a young age was less interested in small talk and more drawn to the questions that underpinned human existence. What makes life meaningful? How does one live with integrity? What does death signify? His early academic path reflected this hunger for meaning. At Stanford University, he majored in English literature and human biology, an unusual combination that reveals the dual pulls on his mind, one toward understanding life scientifically, the other toward grasping the human condition through narrative and reflection. He read T.S. Eliot, Shakespeare, Beckett, and Dostoevsky with the same fervor he studied biology, genetics, and neuroscience. Paul believed literature provided the best lens into human meaning, but biology explained how the mind arose in the first place. The two could not be separated. After college, still searching, he pursued a master's degree in English literature at Cambridge, deepening his philosophical reflections. Yet he was unsettled. Literature explored life's questions, but it seemed to stop short at the edge of death. Science, meanwhile, illuminated the mechanisms of life but ignored the subjective experience. Where could he find the discipline that merged the two? Medicine offered itself as that bridge. By becoming a doctor, he could hold the hands of patients at the border of life and death, living in the very space where questions of meaning were most raw. He enrolled in Yale School of Medicine, where his years as a student transformed him. He describes the surreal moment of holding a cadaver's heart in his hands for the first time, realizing both the sacredness and the cold mechanics of life. Anatomy Lab forced him to confront mortality, stripping away abstraction and replacing it with sinew, bone, and blood. Yet rather than distance him, it drew him closer to the human spirit. Medicine, he saw, was not just about prolonging life, it was about understanding suffering, dignity, and meaning in the face of death. At Yale, Paul discovered his calling in neurosurgery. Neuroscience fascinated him because it dealt with the physical organ that underpinned the very essence of personhood, the brain. To touch a tumor, to sever a nerve, was to alter identity, memory, the seat of consciousness itself. He was drawn to the combination of extreme technical precision and immense philosophical weight. Neurosurgery demanded stamina, intelligence, and skill, but also moral courage. Every decision could define not just life and death, but the quality of whatever life remained. He knew the road would be brutal. Neurosurgery residencies are among the most demanding in medicine, but he felt it was worth it. During those grueling years of residency at Stanford, Paul faced punishing schedules, 80 to 100 hours a week, sleepless nights, operating for 30 hours straight, and absorbing endless responsibility. Yet he thrived on the intensity. The work was not only technical but deeply human. He describes the intimacy of guiding patients and their families through terrible decisions, whether to undergo a risky surgery that might extend life but leave the patient paralyzed, or to let the tumor run its course. These were not abstract dilemmas. They were real conversations with real people, whose eyes searched his for both truth and hope. Paul discovered that the doctor's role was not simply to fix but to guide, to stand as a witness and counselor when choices carried no easy answers. In those years, Paul also met and married Lucy, a fellow physician. Their marriage carried the joy and the struggles of two ambitious people in medicine, often passing each other like ships in the night due to exhausting schedules. Yet they shared a deep intellectual and emotional bond, and Lucy became central to Paul's story as both partner and caretaker. Together, they imagined a future where Paul's career would blossom, where family life and medical leadership would intertwine. But then came the turning point. Near the end of his residency, just as Paul was poised to secure prestigious faculty positions and begin harvesting the fruits of his long training, he began experiencing strange symptoms. Persistent back pain, unexplained weight loss, drenching night sweats. He brushed them off at first, attributing them to stress and exhaustion. Yet they worsened. When he finally underwent scans, the images told a brutal truth: his body was riddled with tumors. Stage 4 lung cancer. The very disease he had so often diagnosed in others now inscribed itself in his flesh. The shift from doctor to patient was disorienting. He had spent years on the other side of the bed, delivering grim news with carefully chosen words. Now he sat where those patients once sat, absorbing his own prognosis. The irony was sharp. He was young, a non-smoker, otherwise healthy, yet struck by an illness usually associated with age and tobacco. His identity as a neurosurgeon, so meticulously constructed, began to collapse. Who was he now, if he could no longer operate, no longer chase the future he had sacrificed so much to reach? But Paul refused to let his story reduce to despair. He turned instead to reflection, leaning on his literary roots as much as his medical training. He read philosophy and poetry again, seeking guidance in the words of thinkers who had confronted mortality: Tolstoy, Nietzsche, Marcus Aurelius. He recognized that death strips away illusion, but it also clarifies. When time is short, what matters most? For Paul, the answer lay not in titles or accolades, but in relationships, love, and the pursuit of meaning itself. Treatment began. Modern medicine offered him targeted therapies that initially shrank his tumors and extended his life beyond the bleak statistics. But the side effects were harsh, and remission was uncertain. His oncologist, Emma Hayward, became a crucial figure. Unlike some doctors who might have shielded him with false hope or cold detachment, she was frank yet compassionate, encouraging him to focus not on how long he had left, but on how to live well in whatever time remained. One of the most poignant parts of Paul's journey was his decision, with Lucy, to have a child despite his diagnosis. They debated the wisdom of it. Was it fair to bring a child into the world knowing Paul might not live to see her grow? Ultimately, Paul saw it as an affirmation of life, a way to plant joy and legacy into a future he might not inhabit. Their daughter, Katie, was born not long before Paul's final decline. In his closing reflections, Paul describes holding her, realizing that though he would soon leave, part of him would live on in her being. To bring forth life even in the face of death was a profound victory. As his illness advanced, Paul faced the steady erosion of his physical abilities. He could no longer perform surgery, his hands trembled, his stamina faded. This loss was not just professional but existential. Surgery was not just a job, it was a calling, the way he expressed his highest gifts. Losing it forced him to confront the central lesson he had often preached to patients: identity cannot be tied solely to what one does. It must be anchored in deeper values. For Paul, those values became writing, family, and bearing witness to the human condition with honesty. The act of writing when breath becomes air itself became his final vocation. He poured his dwindling energy into the manuscript, crafting words as carefully as he once crafted surgical incisions. He did not sugarcoat his journey. He wrote candidly about fear, doubt, and the rawness of dying young. But he also infused it with clarity and courage, refusing to let cancer dictate the meaning of his life. In a sense, writing was his last surgery, operating not on bodies, but on the shared human spirit, offering insight and healing to readers he would never meet. As Paul neared the end, his voice grew quieter but no less profound. He acknowledged the uncertainty of what lay beyond death, refusing both easy consolation and nihilism. Instead, he held to the conviction that meaning was not found in how long one lived, but in how fully one lived in the present. He accepted that suffering and mortality are inseparable from being human, yet insisted that love, compassion, and courage transform them. His final passages, addressed to his daughter, carry both heartbreak and grace. Though she would not remember him, she would feel his love in the foundation of her being. The book closes with an epilogue written by Lucy, who tenderly recounts Paul's final days. She describes how he faced his decline with dignity, surrounded by family, still teaching, still reflecting, even as his breath grew labored. She emphasizes the love that sustained him and the legacy he left not in years, but in depth. Her words complete the arc of the memoir, showing that while Paul's body failed, his spirit did not. Ultimately, When Breath Becomes Air is not just a story about cancer or medicine. It is about what it means to live authentically when death is certain, which is always. Paul's life illustrates that even the most brilliant minds and most carefully laid plans are vulnerable to chance, but also that meaning is not destroyed by death, it is created by how we live in relation to it. His courage, humility, and devotion to truth make the book a gift, a mirror in which every reader sees their own mortality and their own possibility for living fully. To summarize, Paul Kalanithi's memoir takes us through his upbringing, his passion for literature and science, his demanding career in neurosurgery, his sudden transformation into a patient, his reflections on identity and purpose, his decision to embrace fatherhood despite limited time, and his graceful confrontation with death. Along the way, he leaves us not just a story, but a challenge, to recognize that the time we have is finite and precious, and to ask ourselves, as he asked, what makes life meaningful enough to go on living? His answer, lived out to the end, was love, presence, and the courage to face death without illusion. And that's it. Paul Kalanithi's When Breath Becomes Air. Thanks for listening to Book Nibbles. If you enjoyed this bite-sized book, don't forget to subscribe for more quick, insightful summaries. See you in the next nibble.